A big thank you to mpb.com for sponsoring this week's video. Hello everybody, my god I look a state. Welcome back to the channel. A few weeks ago, my good friend Rich, otherwise known as Paperboyo on Instagram, I'm sure many of you have seen his work, if not check him out, he's awesome. He invited me to be a small part of a campaign he was working on in Abu Dhabi, or Abu Dhabi as my little boy calls it. And initially, I wasn't sure whether I'd take him up on the offer because Abu Dhabi is not the sort of place I've thought about too much for photography, and as much as I don't want to be the kind of person who decides where and when to go to places based on sort of preconceptions I have of those places, yeah, I wasn't sure if I fancied going. That said, fast forward about a week, I was offered a hotel room with a bath. So yes, beautiful. Anyway, as you can see, I'm now back from that trip. I landed about 3.5 hours ago, and as little as I slept on the plane, I thought I'd record this video now before I forget anything that I want to say. And while I plan to show you some of the photos I took on this trip, I won't necessarily be talking about Abu Dhabi itself. What I thought would be more interesting would be talking about my first week with my Leica M11. Admittedly, I have done some videos on this camera already. I did a review in October last year, which I'll link to here. But this is the first week I've used this camera as an owner, which I do think is a slightly different thing. And I took a little bit of a risk, to be honest, using this camera exclusively when I had obligations. Could have gone very wrong. I don't think it did. I think I got some good photos. But yeah, I thought I'd talk you through my thoughts using this camera exclusively for a week and nothing else. Just put my 2 bags down first. If you've not seen my latest What's in My Bag video, I've got 2 bags, bag inside a bag. I explained in that video, also linked here. Right, first thing I want to talk about is this screen protector. I don't know if you can see that, but it's peeling after a week. Genuine Leica product, costs £30 in true Leica style, and I think dust gets in the edges and means that the film peels away from the screen. Looks awful, so that's coming off. Complete waste of 30 quid. Well, I didn't film it, but those clouds were amazing. Anyway, the first big thing to talk about is probably image quality, which is a bit silly with a camera like this because obviously the image quality is going to be great. I think it shares the sensor that my A7R Mark IV has. I have no evidence for that at all, other than the fact that it's a 61 megapixel sensor. I imagine it's the same. But you might recall from my review a few months back that I did have some reservations about what the RAW files looked like, in that they were super contrasty, and as much as I like them being DNGs, I didn't necessarily get on with them all that well in my review. Now that could have been down to the lenses I was using. I found this lens, this Voigtlander 50mm Apo, quite sort of neutral in its rendering, but also I've had much more time with those Leica files from my review since my Leica review to play around with editing them and coming up with some presets that make them look nice, to my eye at least. So yeah, no concerns as far as image quality goes, as you might expect. I shot exclusively 60 megapixel files this week, which does mean that I didn't necessarily capitalise on all the dynamic range that this camera is capable of that I would have done if I'd shot at a lower resolution. But I just like having 60 megapixel files, to be honest. Have never once needed a 60 megapixel file, but I like that you can sort of pinch to zoom and get all that detail Lovely stuff. Now, I am not the biggest chimper in the world. I hate having to review my photos every time I've taken photos. That's one of the reasons I love this X Pro 3 that I bought a few months back, because there's no screen on the back. Well, there is, but you have to flip it out. And as such, you end up looking at the photos that you've just taken less. That said, with a brand new camera, which obviously this is for me, and on a job, it's important that I review the files that I've just shot, because, well, I don't want to mess them up. And so checking exposure, focus, all that kind of stuff, it becomes crucial. And I was a bit concerned about doing that on the M11 whilst in the Middle East, because there's no electronic viewfinder on this camera, which is typically what I use to review my files in bright conditions, because obviously looking at a screen when the sun is beating down on it, it's quite difficult. Now on the M11, obviously you have to use the screen to review your files because there's no EVF, and I didn't actually find it too bad a process. There were occasions where I'd have to go and find shade to be able to see the screen properly, or perhaps I'd use my t-shirt, I'd just stuff the camera under my t-shirt and look at it like that. But yeah, in short, I didn't find using the screen too bad. It's exactly what you want, isn't it, from using an £8,000 camera. The word's not too bad. Now the other big thing to talk about, as you might expect, my first week using a rangefinder in anger, is focusing. But to be honest, again, in the Middle East, in super bright conditions, I was shooting typically between f8 and f11, which meant that focusing as a process was non-existent, because I'd basically leave it somewhere near infinity, and everything past a certain point, usually about 10 metres, 5 metres, something like that, would be in focus. So I didn't really have to worry about focus all week. That said, there were times when I did practice focus, and I do think I'm getting a little bit better at focusing. Now initially I have found it a bit challenging focusing, certainly at wider apertures at 50mm. And I wouldn't want to go much longer on a rangefinder at wide apertures, because I think it would just become a bit of a nightmare trying to focus. I don't have the best eyesight either, which is a bit more of a challenge. But yeah, 50mm is about the longest I'd want to go focusing on a rangefinder. But as I said, this last week I've not really actually needed to do it all that much. The battery is really good, lasted all day, every day, but even if it hadn't, there's no way I'd buy another one. Instead, I'd just take a power bank with me and use the USB-C charging when I was having lunch or was in the car or just not shooting, because these things are ridiculously expensive. Any other camera I have, I've typically bought 3, 4, 5 batteries for it. Not this. This is the only battery I will have until it dies, because they are extortionately expensive. And as I say, there is USB-C charging, even if it is in a completely stupid place there. I mentioned it in my review. I still don't understand why it's there. Seems a bit ludicrous to me. What I ended up doing, don't know if you can see this, was I'd stick it down just on the lens, and then the power cable would go into there like that. Seemed the most sensible solution, rather than kind of having it on the corner of a table like that and just having the cable underneath it. I don't know. Oh, one other quirk other M11 owners might have come across, I couldn't get it to charge unless I turned the camera on. I don't know if I was using the wrong cable, but that seemed a bit strange to me, so that's another quirk I've got to figure out. But yeah, battery good, other batteries, no. Now, those of you who watched my What's in My Bag video recently will know that, yes, I got this 50mm Apo Voigtlander lens, which I love. It's a bit big for a rangefinder, to be honest. I mean, look at it, it's a tiny lens. But yeah, it's a bit big for an M-mount lens, but it's pin sharp from wide open at f2. So, big fan of this lens. And I also bought the 28mm Elmarit from Leica. I found this to be a really good pairing. I mean, admittedly, 80 to 90% of my photos last week I shot on the 50mm, and the rest were shot on the 28mm, so not a massive amount of use for the 28, but I think the two pair quite nicely. I'd have probably used a 35mm lens more than a 28, but the thing is, then I'd have been constantly switching between the 35 and 50, and I don't want to be constantly switching. And they're a bit close together, so this gives me more range even if I don't use it as much. And it focuses my eye shooting at 50 a bit more than having a 35 would as well, I think. So yeah, overall a good pairing, but I did use the 50 much more than the 28. Be interesting to see if that remains the case going forward. One of the reasons I was a little bit concerned about going to Abu Dhabi for photography is I'd heard there are lots of security guards everywhere and you're often stopped if you're taking photos in particular places, and I didn't really fancy the sound of that. And on a side note, it seems a bit strange to me that in a place where they want to protect privacy, the way they do that is to watch you all the time. But topic for another time, I suppose. Anyway, with the M11, I found I wasn't stopped nearly as much as it looked like other photographers with bigger mirrorless setups were. So if I'd had my Sony with a 24-70, I think I'd have been stopped an awful lot more because it just looks like a much more professional setup. With this, I mean, it is a professional setup of sorts, but it doesn't necessarily look like it to someone who's a security guard and not a photographer. It looks more like a film camera, and therefore I think it looks a little less threatening. So I found that I was a little bit more sort of inconspicuous with this camera, and I don't think it's got much to do with the fact that it's a black one. I think the silver would have been the same. So that was a real positive. Now, potentially one of the downsides of having a smaller, less conspicuous camera is the fact that it only has one card slot. Now, I say that when at the same time my X Pro 3 has 2 card slots, and so there's probably no reason really in reality that the M11 couldn't have 2 card slots. And I think the reason it probably doesn't is that this does have some internal memory. Now, having 2 card slots or some internal memory is great in a place like Abu Dhabi where you're concerned about security guards, because there were a couple of times where I thought, I'm definitely going to get stopped here. And I had heard stories of security guards in some places asking photographers to delete photos. And I was convinced that was going to happen a couple of times. What it meant was I could just take my card out and I could just keep shooting on the internal memory. And if I was stopped and they asked me to delete photos, I could delete them on the internal memory, but I'd still have my SD card in my pocket with all my photos that I could just take home and not have to delete. Now, of course, you can still do that with 2 card slots. If you're concerned that someone's going to come and ask you to delete your photos, rightly or wrongly, you can just take one card out, put it in your pocket, just keep shooting on the other card, and all the photos on this card will be safe in your pocket. They're not going to go rummaging through your pockets. And I think having 2 cards is still my preference because you can separate those cards away from your really expensive camera. So if your camera got stolen, you'd only have one backup if you'd taken your card out. Whereas if your camera gets stolen and you've got 2 card slots, in theory, you might be able to separate those cards away from the camera and have 2 backups on those cards, even if you've not done any other backups. It just feels a bit safer. In any case, it's probably marginal. What I would say about internal memory, though, on an £8,000 camera is that 64 gigabytes feels a little bit stingy, particularly when you've got a sensor capable of shooting 60 megapixels. And I don't understand why they couldn't have put 128, 256, even 512 gigabytes in this camera, because, I mean, storage is cheap. Surely there's not going to be much difference between the price of 64 and 512. And if there is a difference, just add it on to the cost. I mean, someone's paying this amount of money for a camera, they're probably not going to mind another, what, £50? $60? Come on. Anyway, before I nod off, in conclusion, a really good first week with this camera. As I've mentioned, it costs a lot of money, and so to justify it, I'll probably do a video about my first 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks with this camera. It won't be quite that bad, but there will be some more updates of this camera through the year, I imagine. But as I say, I took a punt using it for a job, and I think it paid off because I really, really enjoyed my week with it. It'd be interesting to see how I get on with the camera and the files in more sort of, I don't know, British weather. And I look around my office then as though British weather is in here. Luckily it's not. Anyway, yes, fun experience. Not necessarily any more fun than I'd have had with my X Pro 3, but I'm going to park that thought because I'm too tired to deal with the fact that this might have been a silly purchase. Of course it's a silly purchase, but as I discussed in the What's in My Bag video, I'm going to keep it for a year or two and just see how I get on, and then probably sell it. And then the difference between what I bought it for and sold it for, that'll just be my rental cost in my head. But I had a fun week with it. Anyway, a big thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, mpb.com, who I used to buy my 28mm Leica and my X Pro 3 and the lens that came with it. Most of my Sony gear, I love mpb.com. It's the place, in my opinion, to go for used camera gear, whether you're buying or selling. And you can check out in my description where they operate, but they have thousands and thousands of pieces of gear at any one time, and any gear that you buy from mpb.com comes with a 6-month warranty. Also, if you're looking to sell some gear to free up some money to go on photography trips of places that you're not sure are going to be good, the process couldn't be simpler. Basically, you go onto the website, you tell them what you've got, what condition it's in, they will give you a quote for that gear, and if you're happy with that quote, they'll arrange a courier to come and collect it from you, and once they've assessed it, they'll confirm your quote, and if you're happy, they'll pay you super fast. It's an amazing process. It's so simple, and I absolutely love it. So whether you're looking to buy or sell, definitely check out mpb.com. Fantastic service. Right, I'm going to go for a sleep. Then I'll see you next week when I probably won't be in a desert. I'll be in Wales, somewhere I imagine, in the rain, around sheep. See you then.